My name is Hekia Bodwitch, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the UC Berkeley Cannabis Research Center. And today I'm going to be talking about barriers to compliance in cannabis production. I worked on this project with Michael Poulsen and Van Butzik. In 2018, the state of California legalized cannabis for recreational use. The state, in doing so, made farmers access to legal markets contingent on their adherence to a suite of environmental practices and reporting requirements. To sell cannabis legally in the state of California, growers must refrain from using non-organic amendments, must plant on certain angle slopes, recently must track and trace all their product from clone to sale, and in certain areas, if not located or hooked up to municipal water sources, farmers must report all their water use, and if diverting, engage forbearance periods. The goal of this multi-agency environmental initiative was to mitigate the effects or perceived effects of unregulated cultivation on fragile ecosystems in California's North Coast. Northern California is home to some of the best hope from salmon run recovery, and unlisted or illicit cultivation practices have been attributed to increased risks of eutrophication or warming water temperatures and corresponding to algal blooms, toxic to fish and humans. California's licensing initiative is also poised to set a new standard for agricultural crop production more broadly. Agriculture is an industry that has been historically difficult to monitor for environmental outcomes due to the diffuse nature of farm locations and non-point source aspect of farm runoff. Governments have also faced challenges in regulating agriculture for environmental outcomes due to the political effectiveness of industry organizations. The outcomes of this legalization initiative, however, have been called into question by what perceives to be or appears to be high rates of non-compliance throughout the state. While the exact number of growers in the state of California is difficult to determine given the clandestine nature of cultivation practices that many farmers assume, industry estimates that 50,000 growers were cultivating in the state of California around 2017, coupled with ideas that this crop has been the state's most lucrative for at least several years now. The 50,000 growers estimated as cultivating in the state is orders of magnitude lower than the several thousand who've applied for permits. The proliferation of growers throughout the state of California has been tied to the legalization of cannabis for medical use starting in 1996. In 1996, the state of California authorized counties to determine the maximum number of plants individuals could cultivate if they had a medical card, provided it did not exceed a cap of 99. Counties where back to the landers had begun cultivating in the early 60s permitted individuals to grow up to the state's maximum. The contributions these farmers made to rural communities has been identified as significant, or at least notable, in part due to the way in which cannabis has been traded with cash. Still listed as a Schedule I substance under federal regulations, cannabis farmers are not able to bank income from cannabis. Cash is more likely than other forms of income to be reinvested locally. The majority of these farms, likely to avoid detection, have been identified as small scale, as GIS images, at least from GIS images. Legalization, however, may be poised to change this characterization of small farms contributing to rural economies. formalization initiatives in other contexts where governments have legalized or authorized previously informal practices of exchange have been identified as corresponding to trends towards industry consolidation as governments legalized larger firm sizes and increased market competition for smaller operations. Understanding the extent to which non-compliance in cannabis agriculture in California reflects structural forms of exclusion seen in other industries, or perhaps is a reflection of growers' desire to remain illicit, rests in part on an understanding of farmers' motivations for compliance. Studies of compliance in other sectors, agricultural in particular, have identified social, normative, and calculated motivations for why farmers choose to comply with environmental regulations or not. Calculated motivations include those related to threat of enforcement or cost. Social motivations can include those related to how an individual thinks others think he or she ought to behave. And normative motivations include those related to whether or not an individual thinks a regulation is just or effective. The effect of motivations on an individual's decision-making is influenced in part by the extent to which an individual is able to comply. An ability is often considered to be a reflection of the total transaction costs an individual must assume to participate in a particular governing initiative. Transaction costs can include factors that are not easily registered as financial, such as the costs associated with increased paperwork to participate in a new regulatory initiative, or the costs assumed when an individual decides to engage in a regulatory practice that goes against the interests of their neighbors who might otherwise have been an important form of support. Access to information can increase transaction costs or affect transaction costs, and not surprisingly, administrative complexity has been shown to exhibit inverse correlations to compliance. Understanding the motivations that influence decision-making can help identify the types of interventions that will most likely address non-compliance in an equitable way. Traditionally, regulation has looked at influencing individuals' calculated motivations for decision-making, but more recently, governments and development organizations have encouraged participatory forms of regulatory approaches to environmental governance, in particular, in part to reflection of the complexities of adhering to and the disincentives industries face to adhere to environmental standards. The idea of regulatory capture has been hypothesized as being less likely to occur with a diverse range of industry representatives. In this project, we sought to understand how industry representatives, state officials, researchers, and environmental organizations could work together to support an equitable legal industry. And to do so, we asked why it is that farmers are applying for permits or not. In particular, we sought to understand the characteristics of those who are complying, what motivates farmers to comply, and whether there are barriers that can be removed to make entrance to the legal market easier. Our study site included the state of California, within which considerable differentiation exists with regards to how farmers experience the licensing initiative. As with medical regulations, the state left it up to counties to decide how they would implement the state's licensing process. Counties were available and have employed a diverse range of approaches to doing so, with some implementing bans, permanent or temporary, on areas in which cultivation was previously permitted. In developing the survey, we asked characteristics of farm sites related to whether or not they were in an area with a ban, as well as characteristics of production related to amount and demographic aspects of farmers, and as well as farmers' environmental practices. We asked about motivational factors related to social, normative, and calculated motivations. And we explored barriers by asking questions about how farmers have experienced the regulatory process. We received IRB, Institutional Review Board approval from UC Berkeley for research with human subjects. We piloted the survey with cultivators throughout the state, both compliant and non-compliant. And the survey went online from June through August of 2019. We worked with farmer organizations to help distribute the survey. And we also distributed the survey to email addresses of those who've engaged in the licensing process with the state, which we obtained